আমরা সব সময় চেষ্টা করেছি এমন কিছু মানুষদের আপনাদের সঙ্গে পরিচয় করিয়ে দেওয়ার, তাদের সঙ্গে কথা বলার, যারা সত্যি অর্থেই অনন্য। আমাদের আজকের এই আয়োজনে এমন একজন অতিথি যার বাবার কথা আমরা শৈশব থেকে শুনি, পড়ি, স্কুলের খাতায় কিংবা কলেজে, এমনকি বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে তাকে নিয়ে গবেষণা এখনো অব্যাহত। আমরা এমন একজন মানুষের অসাধারণ জীবন এবং তার জীবন যুদ্ধ নিয়ে আজ কথা বলবো, যে মানুষটি রন্ধ্রে রন্ধ্রে আমাদের সকলের কাছে দেশনায়ক, নেতাজি সুভাষ চন্দ্র বসু। নেতাজি সুভাষ চন্দ্র বসুকে আমরা অনেকেই দেখিনি, তাকে কাছ থেকে দেখার সৌভাগ্য আমাদের হয়নি, কিন্তু যিনি তার স্পর্শ পেয়েছেন, তার আদর পেয়েছেন, এমন একজন মানুষকে আজ আমরা অতিথি হিসেবে আমাদের সঙ্গে পেয়েছি। আমরা অত্যন্ত ভাগ্যবান এবং আমরা অত্যন্ত কৃতজ্ঞ তার কাছে। তিনি আমাদের ডাকে সাড়া দিয়েছেন। সুদূর জার্মানি থেকে নেতাজি কন্যা অনিতা বসু পাফ আজ আমাদের অতিথি। আমরা সরাসরি জার্মানি থেকে তার সঙ্গে কথা বলবো। Madam, we welcome you on behalf of Tripura, on behalf of all the people of our state to this show of PB24, and we are so grateful and we are so blessed that you agreed to our call. Thank you, Madam, for joining us live from Germany.
Thank you for having me, and I'm very happy to talk to you because the Northeast provinces, of course, played a very important role in my father's life, as you know.
Exactly. Ma'am, to begin with, this is a very curious question. Whenever we told our friends here in Tripura that we would be interviewing you, many of our friends, they demanded that this should be the first question to you. And the question is, Anita being a very typical Bengali name, who kept your name? Was it your father Netaji or your dear mother?
My name was picked by my parents, and what I deduced from a letter which my mother wrote to my Major Jatai Babu, Sharad Chandra Bose. Their intent actually would have been to make it Amita. But Amita is not a German name, and I was born in Germany at the time. And particularly in those days, but even today, there are relatively strict restrictions on name giving. In the sense that it's supposed to be a name that exists at that time, that it was a German name, and so they felt Anita, at least even though at that time it was no German name, was an Italian name, might be acceptable, and this is how I ended up with this name. There is another aspect to it. Anita was the wife of the Italian rebel and freedom fighter Giuseppe Garibaldi, and my father thought he was a very impressive figure, and so his wife's name also meant something to him in that sense.
Excellent. Madam, how do you define, if we can all ask you very humbly, when we say Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, we obviously as Bengalis, as Indians, we have a very different feeling. But your feeling, your emotion would be so different from all of us. How do you define Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose emotionally when this name is in front of you? How do you define him?
Would you repeat the question? I'm not quite clear I got it correctly.
Madam, this is a very emotional question from all of us. In India, every Indians, mainly the Bengalis, whenever we utter the name Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, we have a very different feeling in our deep inside our heart. When the same goes with you, when you utter the name Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, your father, how do you actually take this emotion? What emotion do you have inside when you utter the name Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose?
You have to consider that in a way I know my father only in the same manner that others knew him, because I have no personal recollections of him. I was 4 weeks old when he saw me last and first time, and you can probably imagine that my memory of those days are not that clear. So what I know about my father and what relationship I ever developed to him was partly through my mother and, of course, partly through the tales of other relatives and friends, and also partly what I've read about him.
Right. Madam, as you said, you were 4 weeks old and only 2.5 years old when that tragic incident happened, as you agree that he passed with the plane crash. Madam, if I can ask you, I mean, this question, obviously, that you grew up as a child and then, obviously, as a human being, with Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose being at the back of your mind, that yes, he is my father. How every day, I mean, every day you are living with him, how difficult was it to actually, live with the name Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose till date? How tough and how difficult was it, ma'am?
To some extent, it was not that difficult, because in my generation in Europe, there were many children who had lost their father because they were soldiers during the Second World War, and quite a number were killed, and so it was not uncommon to grow up without a father. When the news of my father's death in the plane crash became known, my mother heard it on the radio. In fact, I must say I don't recall that, because I was only about 2.5 years old, so I have no clear recollection of that period. But I was told that my mother, when she heard it on the phone, on the radio, I was already asleep, and she went to my crib and she cried.
No. If you can please tell us how difficult was it, your childhood days, and then you grow up as a human being, your college days, your university days, and everyone telling you that yes, you are the daughter of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose. Was it, actually when you face people, when they tell you about him more, how could you, or how did you tackle the fact that yes, I am the daughter of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose?
That was easier than you might think, because in Europe he was not that well known. At the time when I was a child, there were still some people who knew his name and knew his role in the during the war period. But as time passed, his name is by no means as familiar today as it is in India, or for example also in Japan. Mm-hmm. In fact, today only people who are interested in history or specific aspects of India are familiar with the name. So I could grow up sort of being my own self without constantly being considered just the daughter of Netaji.
Great. Ma'am, it was in 1934, we all know, and you also told it in various interviews, that in 1934 your mother met Netaji for the first time. Obviously your mother, she must have told you about the incident of meeting Netaji for the first time. For all of us here in Tripura, this would be another interesting story. What did you listen from your mother? What was it when she met Netaji for the first time? What was the incident and how did it happen?
My father had come to Europe because he was released from prison on the condition that he would leave the country. He was very ill, or got very ill in prison, and he came to Europe in 1933. In 1934, he received a contract to write a book, The Indian Struggle, and he was looking for a secretary. And asked one, he lived in Vienna at the time, where he was trying to get medical treatment. Vienna was a very well-known center of medical knowledge at that time. And he asked one of the Indian students there whether he knew anyone who might be able to work for him as a secretary. And this student was conducting an English language course at the time, which my mother participated in. And he suggested her, and in fact another lady, as possible candidates for the job. And my mother went to introduce herself, and she got the job. And from what I've been reading recently, because my daughter and one of my nieces and I, we are engaged in writing a book about my mother. And from reading the letters of my parents and also the journal of which my maternal grandfather kept, we got the impression that there was a very great attraction from the very beginning. It grew gradually because my father was very involved in just the Indian independence struggle, and was of the opinion that this was the first and really only thing that he would concern himself with. But gradually it seems that the attraction grew much stronger, also because there were some common interests. My mother was also interested in Indian philosophy, and so he advised her on some of the readings of Swami Vivekananda, for example. And he was 14 years older, so he also sort of could provide guidance in that respect. And but we got a very clear impression that there was a very strong attraction from the very beginning.
Excellent, excellent. Madam, I mean, your mother, all respect for her. You were a kid that time, and Netaji being no more there. How tough was it for a mother to bring up the child, and what actually was the story at that time? She must have shared with you. How difficult and tough a struggle was that for her? Would you tell us about her memories? Of
course, being a single parent is always difficult. It was at that time, and it is now. But at that time, as I mentioned, I was not the only child growing up without a father. Of course, you had many mothers who were widows at the time, and at the end of the Second World War, you also had a large increase in the divorce rates of those families where the fathers did not were not killed but returned home. But I think nowadays we become more aware of how traumatized the soldiers must have been at that time, and that of course was another reason why many marriages broke up, because there was really very little psychological support that the soldiers got. And so she was not the only one. In a way, it was a bit more difficult for her because she was not a German or Austrian widow. Mm-hmm. So therefore, she also did not get any widow's benefits, mm-hmm. which other widows did at a very modest rate, one also has to admit. But she was able to work because my maternal grandmother and my mother and we lived in the same household, and my grandmother took care of me while my mother was at work.
Madam, can you tell us about the best memories that you cherish of your childhood days? I mean, your childhood is quite different from many of the children in the world. When you were a child and growing up, today at this age of life, can you please take us back to your childhood days and tell us which memories you recollect the most, which memories they really, I mean, give you enough of, imagination at this point of life?
The first memories that I have, strangely enough, were of I must have been actually around about the time when my father died. The Second World War in Europe had ended a bit earlier than in the Eastern Theater of War in May, and my mother and I lived in Vienna at that time in Austria, and towards the end of the Second World War, the American, British, and French military forces approached from the west, and the Soviet forces from the east, and they had agreed on a borderline where they were going to meet. And Vienna was in the Soviet part of that of the world after that agreement, and so in May of 1945, the Soviet troops occupied Vienna, and for some time they stayed in all parts of Vienna, and partly they evicted people from their apartments to put up the soldiers. And that's also what happened to our family. But my mother and I found shelter with our neighbor, and the Soviet troops occupied our apartment. And the first active memory I had as a child, and of course by now I think it's more the memory of a memory, was how I was taken from our apartment to the neighbor's apartment in my crib. For some time I remembered that scene being carried over with my crib. Otherwise I don't have much active memory of those days. When I was a little older, a very important memory for me was the first contact with a member of my Indian family. In 1947, one of my cousins went to Europe, to Prague, for a trade union meeting, and he contacted my mother and said he would try to come and see us. It was not that easy to travel at the time because you had any number of restrictions, and but anyway, he came, and I was about 47. I was not quite 4.5 or so when he came, and I was very excited to get to know somebody from my father's family.
Excellent.
And as I mentioned, it was travel was difficult, and communication in general was difficult.
True.
So it took some time till my mother was able to get in touch with my uncle Chandra Bose, because my father had left a letter with her, said if I don't return, get in touch with my brother and send him a photocopy of that letter. And that, of course, immediately after the Second World War was impossible. So in 1946, my mother made 3 attempts to send a letter, and there was no response. So she assumed that he was not interested and not willing to get in touch with her, and left it at that. My mother was a very proud she was a very proud person, and said, well, if he's not interested in having any contact with me, I'm not going to run after him. So then another Indian in Europe contacted Pandit Nehru and Sardar Patel, and without asking my mother first whether he should do that, and he wrote to them and said that Shubhash has left a wife and a child, and the situation here is not very good. I think you should know that and try to do something. And they got in touch with my uncle. That's the first that he heard about it. And then he, on his part, contacted my mother, sort of blaming her a little bit for not contacting him, but her letters had never arrived. And so in 1948, he traveled to Europe with his wife and 3 of his children. And they came to Vienna to meet us. And of course, that was also a very exciting meeting for me, to meet an uncle and aunt. And I was quite fascinated by my beautiful cousin sisters. And even though I couldn't speak English at the time, my mother was the interpreter. It was very exciting to me, and I think also my uncle was also quite emotional about it.
Golden memories for you. Golden memories for all of us too. Ma'am, you must have heard days in and out from your mother about Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose. I mean, what was the most important thing that your mother always shared about your father, Netaji?
Maybe I should also answer the question which you did not put, is what did she not tell me about him? My mother was a very private person, and my father essentially was very caught up in his struggle for independence. He told her very clearly that India was his first love, and she had to make do with what little was left after that. And I think it must not have been very easy for a wife to live with that situation. But surprisingly, she did, and she never complained to me or to any of the other relatives about it. And when I grew up and was a wife myself, I thought sometimes that this was rather remarkable, because there must have been times when she was quite bitter and frustrated, but she never let me feel that, or never criticized him to me. Although I could well imagine that she had a lot to criticize about the way essentially he felt obliged to treat her as well. But I think definitely for my mother, this relationship was very important, and because of that, I think I was also very important for her, because my father wasn't there. I mean, we tried to figure it out. I think altogether they probably they knew each other from 1934 to 1945 when he died. But they only saw each other relatively short periods of time during that stretch of time, about a year and a half in the 30s, from 34 to 36, with interruptions. And then during the Second World War, when he had escaped from India, trying to get help from other countries for the struggle for independence, the Soviet Union turned him down, allowed him to pass through, and he, the only countries he could turn to were those who were either at war with Britain at the time, or not involved in the war on the side of Britain. So the choice was not very great, even though these countries were all not terribly desirable as far as their ideology was concerned. In essence, Germany, Italy, and Japan were fascist countries, and were fierce nationalists, involving to a lesser or greater degree a rather negative attitude towards people who were not of their own nationality or their own race. I'm using the term race now, even though nowadays it is considered a nonsensical term with regard to human beings. But he had to try to get help from wherever he could. And this landed him in the situation of sort of siding with a undesirable regime in Germany and in Italy, and to some extent also in Japan, because Japan had also led an expansionist war in the area against China and other countries there. But that was essentially the choices he was left with. My mother had the advantage from his coming to Germany that she saw him again. Of course, he had the advantage to seeing her. and they spent about a year and a half together during the time, year and a half, almost 2 years, when he was in Germany. He arrived in April of 1941 and left again in February of 1943, and on a rather adventurous and dangerous journey. You may have heard that he was given the support insofar that Germany provided a submarine which took him around Africa.
Right. Very right.
And that was, for those days, this was quite an exceptional journey for a submarine. It was quite a long distance, and the war was ongoing, and so this part of the journey definitely was dangerous. Partly the submarine met with, first of all, very inclement weather. There was a storm in the North Atlantic, and they came across British boats or submarines, and in fact, I think the Germans sank one of the British boats, providing the survivors with water and some emergency vehicles, so they didn't drown. But my father undertook a number of rather dangerous activities during the struggle for independence, and I think he considered this submarine journey as one of the most terrible, because it was very cramped, it was dangerous, and even today submarines are not the most comfortable and spacious vehicles to travel on, and at that time they were much smaller and more cramped, and so it certainly was quite an adventure.
Ma'am, you were talking about the struggle of our country, the struggle during that period. And when we talk about India's independence, madam, if we talk about 1947 and the partition of the country, had Netaji been there, do you think that Netaji would have agreed or allowed the partition? How do you take that?
Did I understand you correctly? You asked about the partition of India.
Yeah, I'm just asking whether had Netaji been alive that time, do you think Netaji would have agreed, or he would have actually, agreed to the fact that yes, partition should take place, or he would have dealt it in a very different way?
I think he would not have agreed, and of course, as you probably know, Mahatma Gandhi also did not agree with the partition of India, and I always, my father was a great admirer and honored Gandhi very much, even though they had their disagreements. But on that issue, they certainly agreed, and I think at that time I always found it a bit tragic for Mahatma Gandhi that even though he sort of had pulled the strings in Congress all those decades, that at that time when he opposed partition, the Congress leadership didn't listen to him and went ahead with the partition, with agreeing to the partition all along. And I don't know what would have happened if my father had been there at the time. Maybe they are joining forces, Gandhi and my father might have made a difference. I don't know whether they could have or would have prevented partition, but I do feel that if the partition had been unavoidable and my father had been involved in the politics of India, after that he certainly would have worked towards a better relationship between the countries of the subcontinent, namely India and Pakistan, and later on Bangladesh also.
Ma'am, one very interesting fact. You were only 18 years old, in the later half of the 50s, around 1959-60, that you traveled to India for the first time. A girl of 18 years old and daughter of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, traveling to India for the first time and staying with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. How do you recall those days? I mean, listening to it and, getting it from you directly would be a very different feeling for all of us. How do you recall those days?
I traveled to India in 1960. I had finished high school and was just starting my law studies. And sort of in between, I traveled to India for 3 months at the invitation of my relatives. And Pandit Nehru also invited me to stay with him for some time. And so I spent about a week staying at his residence at the time, and we used to have breakfast together because evidently he was a very busy man and was busy during the day with his work. And I got the opportunity to do some sightseeing in the area around Delhi, going to Agra, for example, Fatehpur Sikri, and some of the sites in there, and was taken around to some of the sites in Delhi itself. And I must say he was very gracious and very friendly. And you have to consider the relationship between these two men, my father and Pandit Nehru, was also not just a relationship of competition. I mean, there was some element of competition, but in essence, they were both leaders of relatively young leaders in the 1930s, and they were both rather modern for those days, leftist leaders with ideas for their country which were not that dissimilar. They had the idea that the country should be should be a secular country and not dominated by one religion, or not, say, the Islamic Republic or the Hindu Republic of anything, but it should be a secular state with tolerance between the various communal groups. And when Mrs. Nehru died in Switzerland in, I think it was 1936, my father was present with Pandit Nehru, helped him to make the arrangements in relation to her death, and he had gone to visit her together with Pandit Nehru in Baden-Weiler, where she was recuperating before that. So in a way, there was a friendly relationship. My father was a bit...
Do you recall any particular line which Pandit Nehru told you when you came to India for the first time and stayed in his residence for almost 7 days? Any line or any particular moment you spent with Pandit Nehru? What did he tell you special? Anything you remember?
If I understood you correctly, there are some people who always felt that Nehru was sort of antagonistic and also tried to play down the role my father had played in the independence struggle. But what I wanted to point out is that even though there was disagreement between some of the leaders in the independence movement, in essence they were all working towards the same end. And even though Gandhi and some of the conservative Congress wing people were antagonistic to my father, you can't say today or even during the previous decades that there was, say, one party which was totally opposed to him. If any one party, it was the communists who were in the beginning opposed to him. But in Congress and in all the other Indian parties, you always had some people who supported him, who admired him, who were even loved him and respected him, and there were others who did not. So very often it is felt that during the early years of independence, the role my father had played in the independence struggle was played down. And to some extent that was true, and the narrative was that it was the non-violence movement which brought about independence. I think success usually has many fathers, so it was not one alone. Mm-hmm. But from what we heard from interviews, both with the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time of the so-called transfer of power in 1947, that was Attlee. What he said, and also what Lord Mountbatten mentioned in a meeting to one of my cousins, they said it was very clearly the indirect effect of the army via the Red Fort trials, which made the Indian National Army's exploits known to the general public in India, which caused the disaffection of the Indian Navy, the Indian Army, and also sort of revived the independence struggle, which sort of had been dragging along a bit while the Congress leadership was in jail. And they expressed the feeling that, or the opinion that it was to a large extent the INA and my father's struggle for independence which forced them to leave the country. I think it, as I mentioned, success has many fathers and mothers, so I'm sure it was a combination of both.
Right. Madam, since then, I mean, after the independence, our country has seen so many political parties coming into power, mainly the Congress and now obviously the BJP. And if we name these two parties particularly, I mean, any Indian government, they offered you, your mother, the open offer that you come back to India, take residency here and be Indian citizens, come and join the movement of the country marching ahead. Did you ever receive any such invitation from any of the governments?
My mother, my uncle had asked my mother whether she would be able to come and live in India, because my mother lived with her mother, and so he wanted to know was my grandmother dependent on my mother, which she wasn't. She was born in 1881, so in 1945 she was about 65 years old, and had always been a rather energetic and person, and she was drawing a widow's pension after her late husband's death, so she was economically independent and certainly was able at that time to manage her own life. So my mother could have left her. She also had a sister, my aunt, but my aunt also did not live in Vienna together with my mother and my grandmother, but in another city in Austria. But my uncle died rather prematurely. He was only a little over 60 when he died, and he had started any number of activities at the time. Of course, he had tried very hard to prevent the partition of Bengal. That was one, and was politically active and making plans and starting projects and so on. But he had started so many things because he expected to live much longer, that when he died, his sons, in essence, were not yet fully settled in their professional lives. He had started a number of things, and even though he earned very well, left considerable debts on account of the activities that were ongoing. Mm-hmm. So my mother realized at that point, the last thing that they would have wanted to have an aunt to be responsible for, and for mother it would have been much more difficult in India to work for her own living than it was in Austria. She did not have a great job, but at least it supported her. And having a job at that time was considered very important because during the 1930s, unemployment was terrible less in Germany, but in Austria. It was really a catastrophe. You had healthy, not too old men and women going around begging, and they would come to a house and say, "Don't you have some job for me to do for a warm meal," or something like that. So my mother had been trying very hard to find a job in Austria, and then having a job and which supported her independent of others, I think was very important to her. And she realized in India that would be far more difficult than in Austria. And so she decided that she would not go. And she always used to say, well, the one person who would have made it interesting is no longer there. So that when my uncle died, that idea sort of came to an end. And she lived in fact, she has never been to India. Although she, like many in her generation, she was a very good correspondent, and she kept in touch by letters with a number of the relatives, and usually kept quite well informed about what was going on in the family, especially in Charlotte Bose's family, because of course, my father and my uncle Charlotte had been very close, and in fact, I think very often my uncle's role in the struggle for independence, and also in his support for my father in the struggle, is not really recognized by many people. But he was not only a very capable man; he was an outstanding lawyer, he would have been the one person who might have induced my mother to come and live in India.
Ma'am, another very interesting thing, it was in 1943, Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, he was writing to his elder brother, Sharat Chandra Bose, and there in a letter he wrote that, "My wife and my daughter will take the responsibility of fulfilling the unfinished dreams that I have." If this is the exact line that is put before you, how do you see this particular line? What do you feel about Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose telling you, or maybe directing you and your mother?
My mother, of course, had supported his work all along, and when he wrote the letter to his brother, of course, he could not predict how things would develop and how long it would take for India to become independent. And as it turned out, even though the way independence came about with the partition would not have been what he wanted, it was not that long after his death that India did become independent. So my mother's and my tasks work was not called for then any longer. But my mother also could not have done it alone. If she had gone to live in India with my uncle's family, for example, or in close connection with my aunt and contact with my uncle's family, that might have been a different matter. But she was not so much the person who would have been sort of forthcoming, taking an office or anything as a sort of reflected glory kind of thing. I'm sure you know who C.R. Das is, and C.R. Das died in the mid-20s, and at that time my mother tried to persuade his widow, Bashanta Devi, to take over his activities and sort of be the icon and head of the movement, which she did not want to be. I mean, she was a very capable and active person. After all, she was still quite young at the time, but she did not want to play that role of the leader in a freedom fight. I mean, this role was not uncommon in the entire subcontinent and other parts of Southeast Asia, that very often it was widows or daughters who carried on with the father's or husband's activities after he died. But I think my mother would have been too withdrawn, and I think also as a European it would have been very difficult for her to do that without my father, or at least my uncle, sort of supporting her. So I think if she had gone to India, she would have led a rather withdrawn life, which she did in Europe too. I mean, she was working, but always tried to keep out of publicity, and she did not want any support from India or anything. And
Madam, this year, 2022, 23rd January, we all saw that the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, he unveiled a hologram statue of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, marking his 125th birth anniversary, very near to the Indian Parliament. And this has been a remarkable incident for all of us in India. But what was your feeling when you came to know that this is happening?
The last couple of years, as you know, were very difficult for everyone, and life was somewhat unusual. So a year ago, the anniversary year of my father's 125th birthday was started with a big event in Kolkata. And of course, you might say there was a certain connection with the oncoming elections at the time, to hold this event in Kolkata, of all places, trying to sort of also emphasize the role of my father and get the support of his followers. But there was a plan to do all sorts of things during this year, but nothing much really happened. I was a member of the committee which was set up at the time to organize events during the year, but the committee never met or never communicated. So all of a sudden, 2 days before my father's birth anniversary, the Prime Minister announced that he would want to have a statue of my father put up at India Gate. And let's keep in mind, this was the place where there used to be a statue of King George until somewhere in the 1960s, when it was eventually removed because people felt it was no longer appropriate to have a British ruler statue in this prominent place. So I must say I was very pleased, and all the members of my family were very pleased that such a prominent place for a statue for my father was chosen. And of course, modern technology allows sort of activities in that direction, even before the statue has been actually sculpted. So this hologram was, I don't know what you do with a hologram. You don't unveil it, but I think it was started in any case. So I think that was very pleasing. Somehow I'm not quite sure that this was not a very late decision, because if the decision had been taken earlier, maybe the sculpture could have been done before and all that. But it was a bit surprising. You probably have followed the argument between the chief minister of West Bengal and the central government about providing sort of a float for the parade for Republic Day.
The tableau was not allowed,
which was turned down.
West Bengal government in Delhi, Republic Day parade.
Then I understand, evidently, the central government put up something of their own. It sounds a little bit as if the Bengal offer of the float for the parade sort of started some thinking, and it comes across a little bit as if some of the activities were sort of a last minute, so to say. But I would have preferred if they had agreed on having that float in the parade, or having two floats about Netaji would have been all right. But in any case, I always felt that it was better to compete in honoring him than not to honor him at all. And so I think the statue certainly is a very prominent thing. What I would hope that some activities throughout India really are going to be taken in order to advance Netaji's ideas and ideals, because the statue is nice, but I think conveying his ideas for India and maybe inducing others to follow some of them would be more important.
Right. Ma'am, Indian National Congress, if you allow me to name the party also, was in power for so many years in the country, and it took 75 years for us, when we are saying Azadi Ka Mahotsav, 75 years of freedom, that ultimately Netaji could stand in front of the Parliament House, and he always used to say, Dilli Chalo. Do you think the gap has been too long? We made it too late?
Well, it's not the first activity to honor him, and I think after all, the really very important thing is, and which is not self-evident that it would happen, is that so many individuals in India would continue to honor him and remember him after all that year. I mean, he has not been seen for 77 years. And has not been involved in the active politics of free India. And yet you even have young people like yourself, for example, today who remember him, who are touched by his personality, by his life. And I've also talked to people who lived at the same time as he did, and said, well, I've never met him personally, but I saw him at a distance and made a difference to me in my life. And I think if a person can sort of imbibe this kind of feeling in many of his countrymen and countrywomen, this is quite amazing, and it's far more important than the fact whether a ruling party or some politician pays his respects and honors him. And if you look at many of the villages, you find any number of statues of Netaji in many villages done by local people, and quite simple statues very often. When I traveled in South India and somebody recognized me, somebody gave me a very simple wooden sort of bust of my father as a gift. And I thought that was very touching. Beautiful. And I think that is really the main thing, the fact that some of the parties sort of had their problems recognizing that you might also look at from a different perspective. Very often it was really more to enhance their own party's importance in the independence struggle to gain advantage in present-day politics. And of course, both Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji were two leaders who were exceedingly well known. Probably you could say they were the two most well-known leaders. I mean, Gandhi taking the the first position, no doubt, but they were not involved in day-to-day politics post-independence. And during the independence struggle, there was nothing that a politician could offer to anyone. There were no advantages, no jobs, no money, no rights or whatever that were possible. I mean, in fact, my father put that very clearly: give me blood and I give you freedom, and I have nothing to give you.
Exactly.
Whereas in the ongoing politics of a sovereign country, you run the affairs of the country, and evidently you are also in a position to grant advantages to people. And the moment you have that, you sort of get involved into the political process in a totally different way. So it's not surprising that Mahatma Gandhi and my father are honored in a different way, in a sort of far more almost remote and removed manner, and exalted manner also, than say any of the leaders who were involved in politics post 1947. I mean, I won't mention anyone because then you might say I'm leaving out others. Those who were involved later on, I mean, they also had some of the problems involved in running a country.
You are explaining so beautifully, ma'am, so beautifully. Ma'am, can I ask you this question, though it's a bit personal question, but again, you are no more personal in this entire country and world. When you are daughter of Netaji, and we all know that you have been deputy mayor of the city where you live in Germany, you never had this wish or intention that you will come back to India, you will join politics here, maybe the party called BJP or Congress or any other party, or maybe Trinamool Congress in West Bengal? You never had these offers or intentions?
When I was young, after my first visit to India, I had planned to go back to India, but it was a peculiar coincidence that I met my husband, who was an Austrian citizen in India at the time, and he had lived there and done social work for about 4 years for the blind, and but he had sort of the intention to go back to Europe and maybe later on spend some time in India. As it turned out, our careers worked out differently from what we had originally planned. We both ended up being professors at the university, and actually found being educators quite challenging and interesting. My husband was a member of parliament in Germany, and I was a member of the city council in the town where I live, and deputy mayor, which is a job which you can do beside your professional job. And so we sort of made our home here. If I had gone to India, which certainly in the beginning would have been an option to take, I don't think I would have entered politics because in a way I think I would not have been comfortable with sort of just constantly being confronted with the but your father would have said this or that, but your father would have done this or that. I grew up without my father, and even if I'd grown up with him, I think I'm probably very independent-minded, and I would not have wished to be sort of constantly viewed as the stand-in for him. So going into politics in India, I doubt that it would have been an option for me as such. And if I had gone, maybe I might have been involved in some social activities or educational activities, but I mean, that is speculation.
Ma'am, how do you grade the politics in India? You are in Germany. Your husband has been a member of the parliament there in Germany. You yourself being the deputy mayor of the city where you live. How do you rate Indian politics? For example, if I can give you a hint to this question, 23rd January now in India is a tussle or battle between the political parties that Netaji is mine. Every political party, they garland him in the morning, they have various programs, and almost every one of them, they claim that let us all take his ideology and run the party, run the workers, and let us all motivate ourselves reading Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, though we all are sure that the political leaders, most of them, they haven't read Netaji's life or his writings. How do you rate Indian politics nowadays?
The problems in the 1930s and 1940s to some extent were of course different from what they are now. Some of the problems could be foreseen. In fact, it was quite surprising that some of the problems that would arise in free India, we find that Netaji and also others during the independence struggle did foresee in a fairly clear manner. And others, of course, are totally new because there were developments which could not be foreseen at the time. I think it is perfectly acceptable that politicians of different leaning admire Netaji, they honor him. What I do not like is if they hijack him, so to say, for ideas that definitely were not his. For example, I think the INA was more was a practical example of my father's beliefs that members of different religious creed could work together productively, could fight together and support each other, respect each other's religion, and celebrate each other's religious festivals together. And sort of hijacking him as a Hindu nationalist or so, I think does not reflect his beliefs, because evidently he lived a totally different life, and partly that was also, in my opinion, affected by the fact that he grew up in Bengal, which was a part of the country and what was then the state of Bengal, which was of course more than what Bengal was later on. He was used to Hindus and Muslims living together, because the Bengali culture in many ways, I think, is very much influenced by the existence of these two trends, and many of the leaders in Bengal opposed the attempt of the British in 1905 to separate the Hindu and the Muslim part of Bengal into two separate units. And you might say that the partition in general, but also the partition of Bengal was not necessarily the greatest idea for India's and Bangladesh's development. But on the other hand, India, I think, more maybe than Pakistan or Bangladesh, has certainly been successful in many walks of life. There has been quite an advance in many fields. Of course, the fact that the population grew very fast in some ways makes the country more important in the concert of world leaders, but on the other hand, it also creates problems because it's very difficult to make advances when you have a very fast-growing population with a large section of poor people and not well-educated people. But my father certainly would have, I think, or I would say any of the leaders at that time would have expected that some developments would take place much faster. I think everyone sort of expected that poverty would be overcome much faster, that illiteracy would be overcome much faster.
Right.
But these are things that take time, and partly you might also say maybe the various governments did not emphasize that aspect as much as they could. But I think from a number of developments throughout the world, we know today that social and political structures change much more slowly than what we might think is possible. And so some of the problems, I think, would have occurred if my father had been around just as much. And maybe he might have influenced the politics in some direction, that in some other aspects there might have been a slightly different development.
Okay. Ma'am, I have a very different question for you, and this is not a question. This is, I just want to learn and listen from you asking this. In 1921, when Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, he left the Indian civil service job and he traveled back to India. He traveled in the same ship where he had Rabindranath Tagore. The influence of Rabindranath Tagore in the life of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose has been remarkable and absolutely remarkable. What do you feel personally? How much Rabindranath Tagore influenced Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose?
I think they certainly had Rabindranath Tagore had a very important impact on India, in Indian culture, especially of course Bengali culture in general, and of course their main work was in a different field or with different emphasis. I mean. Rabindranath Tagore was a very creative mind in many aspects of arts and music, but of course he was also a political figure. And my father and he did have very positive relations, and of course what you may not know is that my father had picked the Indian national anthem in 1942.
Right. This is very
when he was in Germany, he established the Indo-German Association in Hamburg, and they were looking for an anthem to sing.
Right.
At that
and not
occasion.
only this, he adopted, he translated one part of the anthem for the Indian National Army in a very different way. He even translated that in a very easier way, the national anthem.
No, but the anthem was chosen in Germany already.
Right.
And also the greeting Jai Hind was chosen in Germany. Because in Germany there existed an Indian Legion, and they were also looking for a way to greet each other, and Jai Hindustani, or Hindustan rather, was a bit too clumsy,
a bit long,
and so they picked this Jai Hind.
Yeah.
Which was, of course, later on taken up by the Indian National Army in Southeast Asia, and even is the form of greeting in the army in India now. But Rabindranath Tagore's Jana Gana Mana was chosen as the national anthem, and just recently I've received the recording of the older version, which was used by the Provisional Government of India as an anthem, sung by Dr. Lakshmi Sehgal, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the Rani of Jhansi Regiment.
Oh, that's excellent. From where did you receive it, ma'am?
Pardon?
From where did you receive the original version of the anthem?
In fact, three different people sent it to me by WhatsApp.
Okay. Ma'am, one more important question. Do you think Swami Vivekananda had equally a very important role in the life of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose?
Swami Vivekananda had a great importance for my father. He definitely considered him and Sri Ramakrishna his spiritual leaders. And whenever he had an important decision to take, he would go to Dakshineshwar, to the temple, and meditate and pray. And before he escaped from home detention to Europe, he sent a niece and a nephew there to do that on his behalf. He was a very devout Hindu, but he was a very tolerant Hindu.
Right. Ma'am, another very important thing, few years back, only few years back, you were in India, and we all saw that you met the then President, Pranab Mukherjee, and your book on Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose and his life in Germany, that has been very well appreciated by readers. Can you tell us about the memories you had that time, meeting Pranab Mukherjee, and what did he tell you about Netaji? Your remembrance on that?
Well, I met the Rashtrapati, Pranab Mukherjee, when he was still foreign minister. Mm-hmm. He had come to my house. Okay. Wanted to talk to my mother and me at the time about bringing back the Netaji's remains from Japan to India. Mm-hmm. And Narasimha Rao, who was the prime minister at the time, he and Pranab Mukherjee were keen to get this done. Unfortunately, a number of people, including some of my relatives, interfered with that insofar that they asked for another commission to investigate Netaji's death, and this sort of postponed it and never got off. But Pranab Mukherjee certainly was a very sympathetic person, and he was very gracious in agreeing to have the book release. That is, releasing the book himself, and for security reasons it was done in the Rashtrapati Bhavan. But actually the author of the book, or the editor of the book I should say, was Mr. Anand Baba, who together with the former ambassador to Germany and important diplomat in the Indian Foreign Service, Mr. Satinder Lamba, had initiated this book, and another one, by the way, on Tagore in Germany, and one was Netaji in Germany, and I had only contributed one article to that book, so it was not my book really. But Mr. Lamba sort of considered this important activity in connection, which was realized after he had left Germany as an ambassador. And after all, Germany had been an important station in my father's struggle for independence.
Ma'am, when we talk about Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, and you being the daughter of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, when you recollect his life, when you read his works, when you read his letters, his other writings, and when you see the videos, if there is one particular point which saddens you the most about Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, about your father, what would be that? Or what is that?
That's hard to say. I think it's all, in essence, it's all one theme, because it's always different aspects of India's future and India's independence, which were his guiding line as far as the political side is concerned. But one should not totally ignore the fact that he was a very religious person and a philosophical person. And when he was a youngster, he was, after all, very bent on religious development, and in fact he, as a teenager, he left home in search for a guru, left home without telling anyone that he would, and his parents, I think, must have been very worried about it, that for 3 months their good boy had just disappeared, but eventually, of course, came back, and I think maybe this experience partly was one aspect to sort of further lead him towards politics, because he grew up in a sort of middle class Bengali family with a fairly anglicized education. I mean, he started school in an English medium school, and the first few years his written English was better than his written Bengali. And as he grew up, he sort of became more aware of the political changes, and the freedom fight before the 20s really was not that widespread as it was then after 2021, which partly coincided, of course, also with Gandhi's taking the leadership in the independence struggle. And I think maybe the most important thing was that my father really did have a single-mindedness of purpose about his country and his country's future and well-being. And I think the degree to which he did that, to which he was willing to risk everything, including his life, was quite remarkable. And I think this is the one aspect which probably makes him so iconic and magnetic for people, because he evidently was a personality who impressed people who met him very deeply.
Madam, I have one letter, written by Netaji to his elder brother. I'll read for you 2-3 lines from it. He is writing in that letter, "Today I am once again embarking on the path of danger, but this time towards home. I may not see the end of road. I have married here and I have a daughter. In my absence, please give my wife and daughter the love you have given me throughout my life." Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose writing this is so emotional, and so emotional a part of his own understanding about life. But being the daughter of Netaji, Anita ma'am, how do you see this emotion of Netaji?
It is an emotional statement, no doubt, but it also shows one thing, that his wife and his daughter did not play as important a part in his life as his fight for independence did, because he was quite determined to leave, and that was, of course, a logical thing for the struggle for independence. Historically speaking, in Europe, the political situation had changed sufficiently that there was not too much hope that India's freedom could be supported from the European side. And there was more hope that this could be done from the Far East. And evidently he was quite willing to forego his private interests, which might have been different, for that purpose. And many men at that time did that, but many men didn't do it on their own, because they were fighting as soldiers because they had to. Some did it willingly, some probably did it because they didn't have an option. But my father very definitely chose clearly and was quite willing to sacrifice his personal happiness for this struggle, which was so important for him.
What has been the best message that you received from your mother, ma'am? Your mother has been a wonderful lady, and we all know that she struggled so much. You have been sharing these stories of your mother also. Today, we also want to know from you that what has been the best message your mother gave in your life. In an interview, I heard you that she was always in the notion that do not imitate your father. Do not want to be like your father. Be yourself. Be independent. These are some of the lines I heard in many of your interviews. Today, can you please tell us what motivated you in her? What has been the most precious message today? What do you feel that she gave you?
Well, let me quote one thing which my mother told me, in fact, not only once, but more often, said, your father was a great, and she put it in different ways at different times, but the essence of it was, your father was a great man, but that doesn't make you a great anything. If anything, it gives you an obligation to try your very best. And but don't get any airs and ideas that you are important in any way. And I think that was a very, valid and good thing to convey. On the other hand, I'm not so sure that I would have been the person sort of to get too arrogant and taken by the fact that I was a famous man's daughter, but I still think it was important, and partly it conveyed something to me which my father had too. When he was a young child, he was the ninth of 14 children. So in a way, it is reported, and what he himself also said, he felt rather insignificant in this family because all the older brothers and sisters were there, and it was a huge family. My grandfather not only had many children, but when he had built his home in Kolkata, he always had many other relatives living in that home, and my grandfather had been a poor man when he was young, and so he always kept some support or some care for the youngsters in his village who studied in Kolkata, because he himself had also had this long trip to the city for his own studies, and it is reported that partly he did his reading under the street lamps, because of course lighting and all that was not so a matter of fact in all the homes, and certainly not in the homes that were not that well to do. And so my father was reported to feel somewhat insignificant in this big family. And I think I in a way felt that too, even though I was not in a big family. But I still think that my mother's conveying this attitude was important. And of course for her life, I think from many, many decades, my father was the sort of the center of her life, and then later I became the center of her life, which was not always so pleasant, because I was a rather independent soul, and I did not enjoy being or did not stand for being controlled by her when I grew up, and I did not care to have her run my life. And that was not always quite easy in our relationship.
Ma'am, this is a bit, you can take this as a very dreamy question, maybe a very utopian thought, but I want to ask this today and ask this straight. Let us take into account that Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose is alive and you are sitting in front of him. You are given, an opportunity to ask 3 questions. What would those 3 questions be you would love to ask your father, Netaji?
Did you ask me what I would want to ask him?
Yeah, exactly. 3 questions, only 3 questions you can ask him, not more than that, not less than that. 3 questions to Netaji, being the daughter of Netaji, or being a world citizen. What would be your 3 questions to Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose?
Well, I'll only put this as a general question now. Of course, there would be more details. There certainly, I would have wanted to know what designs he had for India in a more concrete fashion after, say, if he had become prime minister or opposition leader in 1947 or the years thereafter, what would have been his priorities, to what extent he would have worked towards a democratic system, because he was in a way not unfavorable towards a more authoritarian and centralized system for the beginning. I wonder what mix sort of economic and social measures he would have tried to enforce in India. I imagine that some of the things that he would have wanted to do were not so dissimilar from what Congress did, because ultimately Congress was a secular party, more or less, I would also have liked to see how he would have reacted to the atrocities which took place during partition, because that would have been an absolute trauma for him to see this happen. I don't know whether he could have prevented it. I mean, Gandhi at the time tried, and in some areas he could sort of achieve an appeasement. Unfortunately, I'm afraid it would have happened nonetheless, even if my father had been around, unless he would have been able to prevent the partition as such. But
right, ma'am. All these into one question. What would be your second question to him?
Well, I did not go into the details now. This question, of course, is quite involved. I said it is a general question which I'm going to advance. I might have asked him about some of the things that occurred at different times where we are not so sure about what did happen, what he did think about things, for example, how he whether he really had expressed his true feelings after he was forced to resign as Congress president in 1939, what his true feelings were, whether he was very in fact much more bitter against Gandhi than what his writings show. I think that these are maybe the questions that I could think of right now.
And one personal question, if asked to do so? You have told 2.
It's difficult to say, because since I didn't know him personally myself, I don't really know what kind of relationship we would have developed.
Right.
We might have gotten along famously or not at all, who knows.
Right. Ma'am, your message to the youths of the country, and especially to the youths of Tripura. We have 19 tribes here in Tripura, tribal and non-tribal people living together. This is a state where Rabindranath Tagore came for 7 times. Sachin Dev Burman was born here. And our state has many more legacy to share. But if asked to, how would you send a message to all the youths of our state, girls and boys?
I think the inhabitants of your state live in an area which is not in the mainstream of of India, but I think it's culturally exceedingly interesting. and it sort of has an important position, particularly because it's sort of near a border towards other cultures and other states. And I think that particularly the young people in your state should try to find a synthesis between both their cultural heritage, also in a regional manner, and the modern development which respects human beings irrespective of their creed or irrespective of their gender. And I certainly would also hope that in Tripura the poor reputation of India as the state with the highest violence against women does not apply.
I'm saying, where do you think your father would have been most comfortable ideologically in the present political scenario of the country, ma'am?
You mean, would he have been a member of any of the political parties
exactly.
in India?
Which political party would he would have preferred? Ideologically, where do you find him in today's Indian politics?
It is very likely that he would have formed his own party. Now, of course, Forward Bloc was not his own party in the sense because it was the leftist bloc of Congress. And of course, Forward Bloc has not played an important political role without him. It was sort of a little sideline of the Communist Party. It is conceivable that he would have sort of used the Forward Bloc and developed it as his own party. It would have, in my opinion, definitely been a leftist party. To what extent it would have been socialist or social democratic, I don't know, because it also depends on how things develop. And I certainly think that he probably would have gone a similar way that India did go as far as economic policy is concerned. I think he would also have started with a more leftist planning-oriented economy, which in the beginning also made some sense, but he might have placed different emphasis on some aspects. I mean, you have to keep in mind he had studied for the ICS, the Indian Civil Service, and had great interest, for example, also in the development of communities, not only rural communities, but also cities. So he might have emphasized some of these developments and made some other choices given the possibilities. I doubted that he would have just sort of joined an existing other party. I think definitely that he would have made his own choices. It would have been, as I said, a leftist party, definitely in favor of labor rights and definitely secular. I mean, he would have. I doubt that he would have stood for some of the communal policies that the governments throughout, even during in principle, secular period of the Congress leadership carried out, because I mean, India is a country where all the big religions are represented. I mean, there's a large Hindu majority, no doubt, but there is also a large Muslim minority. I mean, throughout the world, I think the third largest Muslim population is in India, and he certainly respected these religions or Sikhism or Jainism and so on. So
Very true.
I think that would certainly have been a more important issue for a party which he
Very
had
true.
led. And
Very true. You are talking about the actual spirit of the country. The actual spirit of the country. Very right. Madam, I just want to...
about the communal relations. And then I think he would have placed much earlier emphasis on emancipation of women and other disadvantaged groups.
That's a very important area.
For example, I think he would have been more decisive also in his influence on people, not only as a party member, as far as the emancipation of the lower castes are concerned and the lower classes are concerned. I think he had more respect for labor than some of the educated Indians in other walks of life do.
Right. Let me bring the topic of a document here, ma'am. It was on 22nd January 2022 that the Indian government gave a dinner to your family in the embassy of Germany. There you wrote few lines in the visitor's book. The last two words were Jai Hind. Yet today, on the 125th birth anniversary of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose, when you are invited somewhere and you write something in the visitor's book, you write Jai Hind. What do you mean by that? Why do you still write those two words?
Jai Hind, I think, had many aspects in when it was developed as a form of greeting. Of course, it started out as a form of greeting in the Indian Legion and in the Indian Army later on, but I think it also is a commitment to India as a free state, of course, which can sort of live proudly in a community of countries. And today we can see one thing which probably was not that evident 75 years ago. India certainly is one of the global players in the world. I mean, there are obviously, at least from an economic point of view, but indirectly because of that also from a political point of view, there are five large global players. One of the most important, of course, is the United States. By now, China has economically become the second most important, and because of the economic importance, I think it also has a political importance. I think the European Union is maybe the third one, and Russia and India are the fourth and the fifth. And India is, I think, going to gain in importance in this concert. And Jai Hind, in a way, is also a message to India to carry on not only their responsibility towards their own population, but the responsibilities they hold on the basis of their mere size, and also what I would call India has the strongest reservoir of brain power in the world, and this means that she can have a possibly very positive impact also outside the country itself.
Madam, today, I mean, when you are in Germany and we are talking about India, you are sharing your own emotion. What is Netaji to your own children? How do they define Netaji?
I think he's important to them in the sense that they have to some extent studied his life and they are proud of him. Of course, since they have never met him, he's certainly less important to them than the other grandparents, because they have lived with my grandmother, with my mother. Their grandmother, she stayed with us the last 6 years of her life, and even before that, they had lots of contact with her. and also with their paternal grandparents. And their grandfather, of course, like for me as a father, was always a distant person and sort of a more abstract figure. But they are very proud of the role that he has played, and of course we have named our children always a Western and an Indian name, and they also have all chosen an Indian middle name for their children.
Can we know the names, please, ma'am? Names of your children.
My oldest son is Peter Arun.
Peter
The second one is Thomas Krishna. And my daughter actually has an Indian first name, Maya, and a European second name. And they have named their children, my oldest grandson is Nico Peter Arun. My granddaughter is Pia Aruna. And the two younger, the second son's children are Anton, named after my father-in-law, Kiran, and the younger one is Ludwig Surya.
Excellent, excellent. Ma'am, your message for Indian politicians, those who are in the helm of power and those who were in the helm of power, those who would be in the helm of power, what would be your message for them, the real politicians of the country?
Try to avoid corruption. It is the cancer which kills a country. And try to show as much commitment to your country as the freedom fighters more than 75 years ago did.
Okay. Before we end, ma'am, talking to you, I have a very humble request. I would very humbly request you on behalf of everyone here in the studio at PB24 and even the audiences. I'm sure they would also love to listen from you. Can we, have a book in your hand, and would you please read anything that has been written by your father or mother, or maybe a letter that your father has written to your mother, the one which you like the most?
I'll show you something, just a minute. In fact, by chance I happen to have it here because we just took it to Berlin to the exhibition about that. Just a minute.
Sure.
This is a little casket which my father sent to my mother in the 30s. And I'll show something to you.
Madam, can you please show it again? Can you please show it again to the audience? Can you show it again to the audience?
Yeah, just
the box once again. Oh, this is...
It's a sandalwood and ivory casket. And these are the glasses which my father wore.
Oh, this is wonderful.
When he escaped from India. Actually, they were the glasses which he wore as a student. But when he made his escape from India, his eyesight was very bad, so he couldn't go without glasses because he
once again,
can
we see the spectacle once again?
And actually, the case for the spectacles is also quite interesting.
Oh, this is so emotional. Can we see the spectacle once again, ma'am?
And
can you please hold it with both of your hands? Can you please hold it with both of your hands, this spectacle? Oh, this is just wonderful. This is just wonderful.
And so he had to wear some glasses leaving, but he didn't want to wear his the glasses he wore at the time because he was afraid he would be recognizable too easily. And so he took these old glasses, and then of course once he came to Berlin, he had to now did I put something? Sorry.
Yeah, you can show us.
When he came to Berlin, he got glasses which had the powers which he needed at that time, and the old glasses which he had worn as a student, which were much weaker in powers, were kept with my mother, and that's why they are still around. And we just had the opening of an exhibition in the Indian embassy, in Berlin about my father with some of the letters, the digitalization of some of the letters of my father to my mother. And these two objects which I just showed you.
Can we see anything else in your house which you have that your mother or your father used to use? Anything else, ma'am, for us, for the entire state of Tripura?
Let's see. What do
Why
I have?
Tripura? For the entire country, in fact.
Well, let's see. What could I show you? I have some things which one thing I gave to my older son. He had left a sort of a case for documents and papers, but that's not with me anymore. That I gave that to my older son, and he keeps it at his house. And well, I'll show you something else. Actually, I wanted to have this. This is not something my father gave to my mother, but I think it's a nice picture. I'm not quite sure whether it was a sketch made for another portrait or what, or whether it was just a portrait which he made it by Anita Bose, well-known landscape and portrait painter from Bengal.
Mm-hmm.
And I just got it reframed recently, and I thought it was a very nice one because I really liked the photos where my father is in dhoti, even though many of the Indians prefer to see him in uniform, but I like the Bengali dress better than the uniform.
Right. Ma'am, can you please read anything from your father's writings, anything? Or a particular part which you like the most?
Well, I can show you the book which he wrote, The Indian Struggle, and the copy which he gave to my mother, which has an inscription to her.
Oh, it is with you?
Yeah.
Please.
And I'll show you the inscription which... can you see it?
Yeah, this is the signature of Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose. Oh, this is wonderful. Can we see few other pages, ma'am? His writings. Few other pages from this book?
Well, I can show you. This is the photo which he had in.
Oh, excellent.
Which must have been taken around the time when the book was written, and let's see. I'm trying to find, there's another photograph somewhere, I think.
Ma'am, what is written in the first page? If you can read that out for our audience once.
Well, I'll just show you one of the text parts.
Oh, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. The first page, ma'am, can you read it for us? What was written in the first page?
On the last page?
No, the first page. The one that you have shown us.
The first page. You mean the...
Yeah, the one where he signed.
The preface or the introduction?
No, not this. The first page of the book where he signed. What did he write?
Oh, the dedication. Presented to Fräulein A. Schenkel in appreciation of her sustained help in writing this book. Vienna, 19th February 1935, Subhash Chandra Bose.
Excellent, excellent. Ma'am, we want to listen to a particular part from this book. Ten lines.
I'll read the first chapter of the first paragraph of the last chapter, which is a glimpse of the future. As the life of the present British House of Commons will come to an end in 1936, the Constitution Bill for India will certainly be put through Parliament before the next general election. There is at present a keen controversy going on in England between the supporters of the White Paper and the conservative diehards led by Mr. Winston Churchill. For India, the controversy has no interest whatsoever. As we have already seen, the White Paper contains precious little, and few people in India will be sorry if the scheme is whittled down further, as seems likely, or suffers complete shipwreck. What really interests India in connection with the White Paper is the fact that it leaves no room for cooperation for those who may feel tired of the prolonged struggle and would like to settle down to some useful constructive work. The policy of the government, therefore, will help to keep up the present opposition. That was written in 1934, you have to keep in mind. And let's see what the last paragraph says. Well, that's a very long paragraph, so I'll just pick out the last part of it. Let's see. No doubt the Mahatma has condemned the machine civilization of the modern world and has eulogized the good old days when men were content with their cottage industries and their wants were few. But that is a personal belief or idiosyncrasy. Whenever he has expounded the contents of Swaraj, he has spoken in the language of mid-Victorian parliamentarian democracy and of traditional capitalist economics. The 11 points which he enunciated in 1930 as connoting his substance of independence will be unreservedly accepted by any Indian industrial magnate. One could therefore say that the Mahatma does not intend pulling down the modern industrial structure if he were to get political mastery over his country, nor does he desire to completely industrialize the country. His program is one of reform. He is fundamentally a reformist and not a revolutionary. He would leave the existing social and economic structure much as it is today. He would not even abolish the army altogether, and would content himself with removing the glaring injustices and inequalities against which his moral sense revolts. There are millions of his countrymen who accept his method owing to the pressure of circumstances, but not his program of reconstruction, and who would like to build up quite a different India if they had the power. As has been already indicated, the future of India ultimately lies with a party with a clear ideology, program and plan of action. A party that will not only fight for and win freedom, but will put into effect the entire program of post-war reconstruction. A party that will break the isolation that has been India's curse and bring her into the comity of nations, firm in the belief that the fate of India is indissolubly linked up with the fate of humanity.
Ma'am, before we say goodbye, I just have a very humble submission. We live in a state named Tripura, as I have told you, and here in the main city we have a school named Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose. It started in the year 1948. The school is also almost celebrating its 75 years. A school in Tripura in 1948 named after Netaji is obviously a very emotional feeling for all of us here in Tripura. We all invite you in Tripura. Please come and see Netaji Shubhash Chandra Bose. Come and see the historical city with your husband, with your children. And please let us have that, heavenly feeling of sitting before you and looking at you and feeling as if we are talking to Netaji only. You are the daughter of Netaji. We are so humble and we are so delighted to have you amongst us, ma'am. Thank you so much today. Thank you so much. Will you come to Tripura once?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope I get a chance to come to Tripura. I have been to part of the northeast provinces, but unfortunately not to Tripura, to Guwahati and to Shillong, visiting a relative there. And I certainly would like to come and see the state of Tripura and also the
yes, next time you are in India, you must be in Tripura.
Kohima.
Ma'am, next time you plan a trip to India, you must be in Tripura.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And now that you know what Jai Hind means to me, Jai Hind.
Thank you, ma'am. Jai Hind. Thank you so much. আমরা এতক্ষণ ওনার কথা শুনলাম, নেতাজি কন্যা, এবং তিনি কি অসাধারণভাবে তার জীবন দর্শন, নেতাজি সম্পর্কে তার ভাবনা, চিন্তা ইত্যাদি সমস্ত কিছু আমাদের সামনে মেলে ধরলেন। পরবর্তী এমন একটি আয়োজনের জন্য আমরা সবাই মিলে আবার অপেক্ষা করব। আপনাদের সকলকে অনেক অনেক ধন্যবাদ। নমস্কার। PB24 যেদিন থেকে যাত্রা শুরু করেছে, আমরা সব সময় চেষ্টা করেছি এমন কিছু মানুষ